that were designed to warn others to remain within the fold. Like Chambers, I had become the most hated ex-radical of my generation, and like him, I had discovered that the enemies against whom I once battled so furiously were more fantastic than real. I also discovered that I was not alone. Second thoughts turned out to be a natural process that others, less publicly visible than myself, had also pursued. Eccentric as my life seemed, at times even to me, it was not isolated, but more like a piece of the epic itself. As a result of my experience, I have often thought of how different a life looks from the outside in, of the name that identifies me but describes someone else, the external details that convey little of who I am, yet represent me. The problem is not unique to myself, but the serpentines of my life have made its progress unusually difficult for others to follow. Even allies who applaud the present acts of my public self often reserve suspicions of the private man whose experience they do not share and whose intentions they do not fully trust. As for the comrades I have left behind, who are still at odds with what I have become, it is as though I have ceased to exist. To them I can never be someone who felt what they felt, dreamed what they dreamed, suffered and learned through pain. Seeing me as one of them would pose questions too humbling to face. What second thoughts might they have had, too? What illusions would they have to give up now? Instead, they prefer the easier path of denial and revile me as a symbol of one who left them. Worse still, of someone they fear to become. I am now as prominent on the conservative side of the ideological divide as I once was in the ranks of the left. But the conservatives I have joined are unlike the enemies I once imagined. The name itself does not begin to identify who they are, or who I am. The collapse of communism and the progressive future reveals how the moral language of politics has been hijacked by radicals. The fallen angels of the progressive left, Marxist and socialist, have been exposed as the reactionary ghosts of an oppressive past. It is the ideological adversaries of the left who float on the wave of a future that is free. Among my new comrades in arms, many began with second thoughts, having started out as 60s radicals like myself. Indeed, in the last few years, the nation as a whole has begun to draw back from the radical decade and its destructive agendas. What I had learned, one way or another in the course of my journey, other Americans seem to have learned as well. Irving Kristol, who had second thoughts before me, has observed that every generation faces a barbarian threat in its own children, who need to be civilized. This is the perennial challenge, to teach our young the conditions of being human, of managing life's tasks in a world that is and must remain forever imperfect. The refusal to come to terms with this reality is the heart of the radical impulse and accounts for its destructiveness, and thus for much of the bloody history of our age. My own life, which has often been painful and many times off course, is ultimately not discrete, a story to itself, but part of the narrative we all share. Part 1. Black Holes, 1904 to 1939. He had no home in dat rock, don't you see? Negro Spiritual. Fievel. What my father left me, really, was a few stories. They were mainly about himself, but in one instance the story was about his father, whom I hardly knew, and who died from cancer when I was 6. In fact, my only clear recollection of my grandfather Morris, a memory forever sharpened with remorse, is that when I was 6, he sat on my favorite record of the Seven Dwarfs singing, "Hi-ho, it's off to work we go," and broke it. And that I yelled at him, protesting the injustice with all the force my small lungs could muster, as if my yelling could make the record whole. And that, shortly afterwards, they took my grandfather to the hospital, and I never saw him again. It was nearly 50 years ago that my grandfather vanished. I am sitting now in my own home, leafing through a photo album I inherited from my parents' house. The album is encased in red velvet and embroidered with white roses. Its latch is broken, and its edges are frayed. The front cover is inlaid with porcelain, and there is a scene showing two lovers eternally holding hands in a Victorian garden. Inside, there are rotogravure photographs of stiffly posed children and adults, some with Semitic features, some with high Slavic cheekbones and Oriental eyes. They are smartly outfitted, but in different national styles. Some have waistcoats and high collars and look Americanized, while others wear Russian blouses and boots. The facial resemblances could be to either side of my family, but they look more like what I imagine my mother's forebears to be. I am probably mistaken, however. On other pages the photos have fallen out of their frames, exposing the white backing, and there are pencil marks in a child's hand. They spell out the words, Fievel Anna, Fievel Anna, Fievel Anna. This is my father's name and his mother's. It is as though my father had written them to practice his English script, suggesting that the pictures are not my mother's relatives, but his. Who were these people? I don't know. I do not see my grandfather Morris, or his wife Anna, or anyone else I can recognize. There is not a single name in the album that is familiar to me, and no one is left who remembers who these people were who can tell me. What else is this life about but vanishing? We come and go as strangers. We disappear even in advance of our deaths. Do we ever know ourselves? I can remember swearing as a youth of 20 that I would never become the man I eventually was at 40. Who could be more surprised at the way my life turned out than I? There is more than enough pain in the memories I have left behind me, yet I seem to have become accustomed to these losses, to see them as necessary, and, in some cases, even beneficial. My mother is now the last survivor of everyone who preceded me. Past 80, and no longer coherent beyond a sentence or two, she has developed her own mantra to answer the questions for which she has no answer. Life is a mystery. I expressed this thought to my father once, when I was a college student encountering mysticism for the first time. He was a Marxist, and apparently could not face the possibility that life might be a puzzle without a solution. The words sent him into a rage, like a pious man confronted by blasphemy. Having embraced the truth of Marxism, he was convinced he had discovered the key to life's important questions, and did not want his son to throw it away. Political utopians like my father had a master plan. They were going to transform the world from the chaos we knew into a comfortable and friendly place. In the happy future they dreamed about, there would be an end to grief from life out of control, life grinding you down and smashing your gut when you expected it least. Human cruelty would go out of style and become a memory in the Museum of Historical Antiquities. In my father's paradise there would be no strangers, no one who felt like an outsider, alienated from others and at odds with themselves. For 35 years I followed my father's footsteps and believed in his earthly redemption, until a day came when I realized that there are tragedies from which one cannot recover, and alienation that no revolution can cure. That we are the mystery, and this is the only truth that matters. My grandfather Morris was a wraith of a man, barely 5 feet tall, with doleful eyes and a shock of white hair that fell mournfully to one side. His real name was Moishe, Moses. Like his namesake, my grandfather had escaped a kind of slavery in the Pale of Settlement on the western verge of the Tsarist Empire. With his wife and 2 infant children, he had left Russia in the Exodus of 1905, coming to America with thousands of others who were fleeing the pogroms of the Hetman Pietlura. Like the Hebrews of Exodus, they crossed the sea and made their way to a promised land. Only my grandfather was not at all like Moses. He had led no one, indeed had been led, by the nose, if my mother told the story, by his wife Anna, a short, abrasive woman with thick, braided hair that she knotted in a bun. It was Anna who had created the family, marrying Moishe to save him from the Tsarist conscription. Anna's word was law in their household, just as, in a more covert way, my mother's word was law in ours. They had started out in Mazur, a city located in the western Ukraine, where my grandfather was a tailor. The immigration officials at Ellis Island had translated his surname, which was probably Gurevich, to Horowitz, and he had accepted the change, like the other circumstances of his life, as an unalterable fate. Arriving in America, they had settled in the Delancey Street section of the Lower East Side in Manhattan, where my grandfather found employment in a sweatshop, which paid him $3 a week.